Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special treat tonight. We have with us Michael Uslan, who not only is a comic book historian extraordinaire, but he also designed and taught the very first accredited college course on comic books, which gave comic books a much-needed dose of credibility in the 70s. Then he went on to write for DC Comics such titles as The Shadow and Batman. And then in 1989, he unveiled to the world his vision of Batman, which opened up the floodgates for the comic boom in the early 90s and for all the many great serious comic book movies that we've had since then. He's shown the world that comic book movies can be made for serious adults. Interviewing him tonight is Mr. Jim Ridley, who is an acclaimed film reviewer for the Nashville Scene. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the man who's made it his goal to eliminate the words pow, zap, and bam from all newspaper headlines from now on, Mr. Michael Uslan.
Thank you.
Hey, I just did anybody happen to see Michael last year at the Nashville Film Festival? If you know from seeing that, Michael's one of the greatest public speakers I've ever seen, and my job is just to shut the hell up. So we'll try to cut this off and give you all a chance to ask questions, because I know you've got a ton of questions. I guess just to get started, I mean, could you talk a little about why Batman?
Yeah, I can. So I'm 8 years old, and I have just graduated from Richie Rich. Those of you who remember Richie Rich, for those of you who don't, he was Donald Trump in short pants. I had graduated from Casper the Friendly Ghost to Archie Comics. Yeah. I was convinced by age 12 that my high school life, dating, the entire social life was going to be just the way I read about them in Archie Comics. There was never a malt shop, however, at my high school. I was severely disappointed in life. And then when I was 8, I graduated from Superman to Batman. Batman was darker. Batman was scarier. Batman, you had to move into a world where Gotham City was not quite as light and bright and kiddie-friendly and family-friendly as Metropolis was. But I'll tell you something, when I was 8 years old, I so identified with Batman. Here, at last, was a superhero who had no superpowers. Batman's greatest power, I contend to this day, is his humanity. And when you're 8 years old, or maybe when you're 18 or 28 or 58 or whatever, the idea that there can be a superhero with no superpowers is empowering to the reader. Because you can be Batman, you can be Batgirl, it's conceivable. When I was 8, in my heart of hearts, I truly did believe that if I studied very hard, and if I worked out really hard, and if my pop bought me a cool car, I could be this guy. And the other magic for me was Batman had the greatest supervillains in history. As Stan Lee has always claimed, the only way to understand which superheroes will have the longevity and the popularity is to look at their supervillains and to see if they are strong enough to carry a hero through the decades. Because ultimately a superhero is defined by his supervillains. And for Batman, he had some of the most disturbed, psychologically damaged people the world has ever seen as his quote-unquote supervillains. You don't get the giant aliens and the giant robots and the genies anymore. What you get are truly, truly disturbed individuals that once again can bring a chilling effect to you, where as Christopher Nolan, the genius, who deserves all the accolades, all the credit for Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and wait till you see coming up, The Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, we meant to ask you, how's that going to end?
So speaking of the Nashville Titans, I really think that this year I would never do anything.
We'll get back to you on that.
I would never do anything to impair your enjoyment of going to a film when you don't know everything that's already going to happen, when you don't know every single thing behind the scenes that's going to take place. You know, folks, I'm an old fart. I know I am. But I almost will be ready to beg you to not look at the internet, to not look at all the pictures, to avoid all of it, and just go into a dark theater and be enveloped in the darkness and take a journey and let movies take you and let you escape. And it's such an amazing experience when you don't already know everything. So I'm an old-fashioned advocate when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, how's it end?
There's these words, and it says the end.
Well, I guess everyone has a copy of the book, which is just a delight, not only to read, but it's beautifully designed too. Obviously, a labor of love. In some ways, most good superhero stories involve an origin story of how the partnership came together. And one of the things I love most about this is about your lifelong friendship that you describe in here with a fellow comics fan, comic book fan. If you could talk about that a little.
Oh, I sure can. Bobby Klein and I became, and Bobby, by the way, is one of the guys responsible for the Grand Comic Book Database. He is incredible. Worked with Howard Keltner on that. Bobby and I met in 5th grade. He was a new kid that came to our school, and there's a whole story about how Bobby and I exactly met there. But I agreed to share my locker with him because we were baby boomers, and there were too many kids in every classroom and not enough lockers, not enough anything back then. And I opened up my locker door to let him put his jacket in, and he saw hanging in my locker an autographed picture of Superman. And that was it. We found out that we both had common interests in comic books, fanatical interests in comic books, and this was before the internet. Comics were a very isolating hobby. You didn't know there was anyone out there like you who was into it like this. There was no way to access that. And to find a fellow fan was an amazing experience. Well, it wasn't that many years later. You know, there had been a big scare in this country starting in the 1950s, where comic books were accused of everything from being a communist plot to subvert the youth of America to being the primary cause of the post-World War II rise in juvenile delinquency. And in fact, there were also claims that comic books caused asthma because children were staying inside to read them instead of playing in the fresh air. So comic books were under severe attack. There were public burnings of comic books in many cities around the United States at that time. And my friend Bobby's dad got really upset one day. I don't know what Bobby and his brothers did, but that was it for him. He had enough, and I was in the house, and he took the fireplace shovel and shoveled Bobby's comic book collection into the fireplace. And I sat there and watched in abject horror as Fantastic Four number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 went up in flames. A little thing called Amazing Fantasy number 15 that introduced Spider-Man to the world. The first issues of Green Lantern and Flash, goodbye. The first run of Avengers and X-Men in cinders. And from that trauma, we became bonded for life, and we set out to kind of repair the damage and repair the comic book collection. We did figure out in the recent years that on that particular day, Bobby's dad probably burned up something north of $700,000 worth of comic books. But that was the world in which we lived. Some of you might have read in history books, and a couple of you might remember that that was also an era where they were burning rock and roll records. Elvis Presley was considered a tool of the devil, bringing rock and roll into our homes. So, people were always looking to blame something for their children and their children's behavior. And if it wasn't rock and roll and Elvis Presley, then it was comic books. If it wasn't comic books, it soon was Saturday morning TV, video games, rap music, anything but themselves. So that seems to have been the record historically.
So when you got to Indiana University, this was sort of the attitude toward comic books when you arrived. And so when you went in to pitch your idea for a course on comic books, what kind of response did you get?
It was the early 70s. A time of great experimentation on college campuses. And because there are some people here under 21, I will say nothing further about that. But in response to the times, Indiana University in Bloomington started an experimental curriculum department in the arts and sciences. The deal was this: if you had an idea for a course that had never been taught anywhere and could get the backing of a department on campus, you then had the right to appear before a panel of deans and professors to pitch your course. So I chose to create the world's first college-accredited course on comic books with the backing of the folklore department, because I maintain that comic books, superheroes, are contemporary American folklore. They're our modern-day mythology. The ancient gods of Greece, Rome, and Egypt still exist, only today they wear spandex and capes. And for those of you who doubt it, I always turn to you and say, the Greeks called him Hermes, the Romans called him Mercury, I call him the Flash. It's all the same stuff. So I went in to pitch. Now understand, at this particular moment in time, my hair was down to my shoulders. I was wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt. I had love beads around my neck, thank you very much. And I went in with a pile of comic books. And as I walked into this dark, long conference room with a big conference room table, and the dean was sitting at the end with a little pair of half glasses perched on the tip of his nose, and he looked down at me over his glasses and said, "So you're the fellow who wants to teach a course on funny books at my university?" I knew I was in deep trouble. And I launched into the first pitch of my life. He let me speak for no more than 2 or 3 minutes. He cut me off and said, "Mr. Uslan, stop. I don't buy any of this. Come on, comic books as mythology and as art." He says, "Give me a break. Look, I read Superman when I was a kid. I read every issue of that. All comic books are cheap entertainment for children, nothing more, nothing less. I reject your theory." Well, folks, there are moments in our lives that are game changers. This was a game-changing, life-changing moment for me, because I could have picked up my comics, turned around with my head bowed, and walked out. Instead, I stood my ground, and I looked at the dean, and I said, "Sir, may I ask you 2 questions?" He said, "Ask me anything you want." I said, "Are you familiar with the story of Moses?" And he looked at me like I was nuts and said, "Well, yeah, so?" I said, "Very briefly, Dean, could you just summarize for me the story of Moses?" He said, "I don't know what game you're playing here, but I'll play this with you. The Hebrew people were being persecuted. Their firstborn were being slain. Hebrew couple placed their infant son in a little wicker basket and sent him down the river Nile. There he was discovered by an Egyptian family who raised him as their own son. And when he grew up and learned of his true heritage, he became a great hero to his people." I said, "Dean, thank you so much. You said you read Superman comics when you were a kid. Do you remember the origin of Superman?" He goes, "Well, sure. The planet Krypton was about to blow up. A scientist and his wife placed their infant son in a little rocket ship and sent him to Earth. There he was discovered by the Kents, who raised him as their own son. When he grew," and then he stopped. He stared at me for what I swear to you was an eternity and said, "Mr. Uslan, your course is accredited."